Welcome to the Big Seance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the seance.
Steele Alexandra Douris is an author, artist, and Victorianist, specializing in Victorian crime, gothic fiction, and spiritualism. She is a PhD candidate in the English department at Stanford University, where she has taught courses on Victorian Spiritualism, ghost stories, and the Gothic novel. She holds an MA in English from Stanford University and a BA in anthropology from the University of Texas at Austin. As an undergraduate, Steele observed the social behavior of lemurs, wielded a trowel as part of a Central Texas archaeological dig, and learned to identify primate fossils and human bones. As a graduate student, she disappeared into the archives of Victorian Britain and now emerges only periodically to collect new tarot decks, hunt for fossils, and hoard art supplies. I love it. Steele splits her time between foggy NorCal and sunny South Texas, towing her mountain of journals and sketchbooks with her wherever she goes. You can learn more about Steele by visiting SteeleAlexandraDouris.com. And if you need to know the spelling, all of that will be in the show notes. Welcome to the Big Seance Parlor, Steele.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I am so excited about this. I was telling Steele, as you know, just from the name of our podcast, this is going to be so right up the listeners' alley, and we are just going to not know when to shut up, but we're going to have to at some point. You know, the book that Steele is going to talk about today, or I'm going to totally nerd out about today, in which I have read, is Spirits, Seers, and Seances, Victorian Spiritualism, Magic, and the Supernatural. It is so good. It's been out for a while. It came out in September, right?
Yes.
I could pick it back up today and start reading it again. It was delicious. But before we dig into the book, Steele, you are many things, but you're also a Victorianist. What is a Victorianist? Where did your passion for all of this come from? And how can I just be you? Because I think it's all so cool.
Thank you. Yeah, I love the label Victorianist because I hadn't heard it until I was applying to graduate school, and I knew I wanted to work on 19th century literature. And I heard people talking about, oh, well, this Victorianist professor at this school or that Victorianist professor. And I was like, oh, that's a name. That's a thing. I love it. Perfect. So yes, as you read in the bio, I actually majored in anthropology with a focus in archaeology in undergrad. So I've always known from a pretty young age that I was very interested in the past, in history, paleontology, archaeology. I've always been a very kind of past-facing person from a young age. But I think it took me a little while to sort of find exactly where I was sort of most at home academically. I bounced around. I loved my major, but I was really excited to delve more into sort of the literary history side of things for grad school. And so I really have sort of found my home kind of at the intersection of literary history, like cultural studies, and obviously like the history of spiritual movements and occultism. And I really like to look at it. I like to look at it from a historical or cultural perspective. And then I also really like to mix in the literature and the art at the time. And so yeah, it's been a really exhausting but fun degree.
I mean, were you this kind of nerd, which I love, when you were young? Was it a, I retired as a middle school teacher. I picture a lot of the giant nerds that I love walking around with noses in books. I mean, where did it come from?
So, couple of things. When I was a kid, I was convinced I was going to be an archaeologist. That was my thing. I wanted to dig up, Pompeii, basically. I think I saw a documentary at a formative age when I was 8. And I was like, I am going to, go to the pyramids, go to Pompeii. And then I was also a great lover of fantasy novels. I really kind of latched onto fantasy specifically as a genre at a very young age. And I really loved fantasy and also historical fiction as I got a little bit older. And then once I was a teenager, I became more interested in kind of classic literature, but definitely at a young age. And then this is such a random kind of, it's random, but it's not. I was absolutely obsessed at a very young age with James Gurney's Dinotopia books, which are for very young kids, but they're also this mix of fantasy, paleontology, archaeology, and art. And so I think from a really young age, I was just really fascinated by the intersection of art and kind of what I jokingly refer to as all of the ologies, archaeology, paleontology.
And did you have a family that was supportive of all this nerdiness?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, my mom is just a very open-minded person, and my brother is as big a nerd or bigger than I am. So definitely.
So, pun intended or pun not intended, I don't know which, but what was your favorite part about digging around and doing research for this book?
Oh, gosh. So where do you even start? Let's see. So I'll start with kind of the first, what really gave me the idea to work on the book and kind of go from there. It was research partly for my dissertation and partly for a class that I was going to teach on the Victorian ghost story in connection with Victorian Spiritualism at school. And it was the first class I was designing myself. And so I really wanted a really strong historical component. So I started digging around. I work a lot in newspapers, 19th century newspapers, 19th century periodicals, and early 20th century women's magazines. So I love newspapers, old magazines, love it. So I, of course, was immediately, whenever I'm thinking about any historical question, I'm always like, well, what did the newspapers have to say about it in 1856 or something? And when I started researching spiritualism quite early on for this class and for my dissertation, I was amazed by, and I've said this before online, but amazed by how many spiritualist magazines and newspapers and periodicals there were. There were just so many more than I had realized. And some of them were so prolific. Medium and Daybreak, I think one of the biggest ones. It was for decades. They were publishing, I think, weekly. So there was so much more material than I had realized. And the material really just gave me a glimpse into the entire sort of engine of the spiritualist community, beyond just what I had pictured at the beginning was just sort of seances and, a dramatic seance scene. But when I started going through the newspapers, I saw advertisements for, working mediums and information about regular spirit circles that gathered. And I was sort of able to see the actual community. I could envision these people kind of outside of the seance room, going to lectures together, theosophical lectures, and then going out to lunch and talking about what they'd learned. So I could see this whole other side of it that you don't necessarily see as much in movies. Maybe if there's a Penny Dreadful type TV series, if there's a seance scene, there'll be a very striking seance scene, but you have no idea the whole community beyond that. And then, I just sort of went from there. I loved getting to include an actual 19th century crystal gazing exercise. That was probably one of my favorite things. I got to really kind of pull that. I edited a little bit for clarity for a 21st century reader, but otherwise the exercise itself is straight from a periodical from the 1890s. And I was just very excited to include that.
Yeah, you're referring to, you have this section called Try It Yourself.
Yes.
At the end of, I think, every chapter. And I think that's really cool, especially for someone, I only came to this paranormal nerd stuff 15 years ago, I would guess. So I'm late to the party, really, but I've done a lot of catch up and completely, I dove in and I've done paranormal investigation and I can't stop reading and I want to be a Victorianist, and I don't know where I was going with that. But, for someone new like I was at that time, it is perfect because all the different parts and the different elements of spiritualism that came together, you give a little try it yourself section, holding a traditional spirit circle, sit for a solitary seance. You know, what do you do when you're the only nerd in your area who wants to have a seance? Well, you can have a solitary seance, and automatic writing and automatic art, channeling your inner folklorist. You know, I saw that and I was like, what? Great idea. Explore your own shadow and read a gothic tale and make a Halloween card and hold a Christmas seance. I mean, that's really cool. So that's going to be really helpful for someone wanting to dip their toe in, but, you know, maybe they're not sure how to do it. Really cool. And then I also wanted, actually, it's like the last question that I was hoping to ask you, but you were talking about all the women's newspapers and magazines. Yeah. And I haven't talked about it much, but I have spent an embarrassing number of hours digging through, like, do you know the Delineator?
The Delineator.
The Delineator, I think, is a little, probably no earlier than late Victorian, but turn of the century women's fashion magazine. And every fall around October, they had great instructions for how to throw a Halloween party and how to design your invitations and what to say and where to put all the fruit in the house and what to hang and dance cards and where to, you know, the bobbing for apples and where to get your decorations. And oh my gosh, hours and hours. I have looked through some of those, and that's immediately where my mind went to when you talked about that. You know, Victorian Halloween parties, which are so delicious.
Yes.
I read in your book, and I had never heard of this idea of tableau. Is it vivant or vivant?
Tableaux Vivant. I think it's vivant. I haven't studied French, actually, so every time I say
haven't either. Tableaux Vivant. And when I read about that, and I'd never heard of it, it makes me want to throw a Halloween party right now just to do this. Yeah. Will you tell us about these tableaus? Because I was like, what? That's a thing? Oh my gosh. And I wonder how many people are doing it now in 2023, 2024, and don't know that it was a Victorian tradition.
Absolutely. Yes, it's sort of interesting. So Tableaux Vivant, I believe they became popular in the late 18th century and then were very popular as sort of a party activity in the 19th century before sort of falling out of favor in the first decades of the 20th century. So the idea basically is that it's sort of halfway between visual art, fine art, and performance art. So people don't move around, but what they do is they try to create a picture, basically. So they'll pick typically a scene, typically from literature or from mythology. So they might choose, I think an example I give in the book that I actually found in a early 20th century women's magazine was the Three Witches scene from Shakespeare's Macbeth. So they pick something sort of seasonally appropriate. They did these obviously at all kinds of parties, not just Halloween parties. They would have started, I think, before a lot of these Halloween parties even became popular, but they would pick something and choose a scene, and people would essentially be cast as certain characters, and they would put together, you know, it's kind of a very DIY project because a lot of times they're doing it in the course of like a party, right? So
they didn't go to Party City and get a backdrop and
exactly. So, but they would try to set a scene, and everyone would have to assume like a certain pose. So it's very different from traditional theater in that they can't really move around or act. But at the same time, it does put a lot of pressure on everyone to sort of strike a very, you know, a pose that manages to tell a story, because they have to kind of tell a story or really bring a moment in a story to life without being able to move around or talk. So it's its own kind of art. So people in the party would all be involved. They would all have their own roles. And then they would at a certain point freeze. And I think sometimes they would even say like tableau or something. And so everyone would freeze. And it was sort of a way almost to like take a picture before they would have probably had a camera at a party. They wouldn't have been able
to take a picture of it. So how cool they could experience and have the experience. And, you know, it probably caused all kinds of discussion and then it's gone. There wouldn't have been a picture of it in most cases, I imagine.
Exactly. Well, and I think weirdly enough, around the time Tableaux Vivant fell out of favor was around the time that actually cameras were becoming small and portable enough that they could have photographed themselves. But yes, so I found that in one of the women's magazines that I was looking at for the Halloween parties, like you were talking about. And as soon as I knew what Tableaux Vivants were, but I hadn't thought about it at all in the context of the book. And then when I saw it in that article, I was like, I have to include it. It's so Victorian. It's so Halloween. It's perfect.
And I just think about, now they have, like I was saying, they have those backdrop things that you can get, and people take their selfies in front of them at parties. And I'm like, oh my gosh, are we doing that? And we don't even know.
I had that moment too, though, because I spent all this time kind of explaining what it was and then going through the exercise. And then at the end, I say like, oh, you can take a picture of it and put it I think I even say like, you can put it on Instagram. And then I sort of froze. And I had this moment where I was like, have I just described to them like how to take a picture of a scene for Instagram, which is the thing they already know how to do? Like, I think I've gone so Victorian, I've gone full circle, and I've just like explained how to photograph your living room for Halloween.
And we're all Victorianists and don't even know it. Yeah. And speaking of that, I had 2 aha moments right off the bat at the beginning of your book. I consider myself pretty obsessed with the Victorian era, not in an academic sense or anything, but I just love learning about it and reading about it. So 2 things. One, I learned that we tend to look back at the Victorians as old-fashioned and something old that we find fascinating. And so some of us dream of putting away our modern tools and technology to pretend we're Victorian. But in reality, Victorians were all about becoming modern with the huge advances in technology that was happening at the time. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And then the second thing is you say it's hard to move in many modern occult circles without tripping over the Victorians. And yet somehow in the process of becoming ubiquitous, the Victorians have also become invisible, which I was like, oh my God. Do you want to talk about any of that?
Absolutely. I think I'll start with the second point. That was another part of the book that when I was first conceiving of the book, that it was really important to me, because as someone, as a Victorianist, I'm also really fascinated by neo-Victorianism. So whenever someone writes a modern book or there's a modern TV show about the Victorians, I'm really fascinated by, what are the Victorians to us, right? Every kind of era, they're their own era. And then they also sort of, in a weird way, reinvent the eras before them. Like the Victorians had their own obsession with the medieval period. And the way the Victorians thought about the medieval people was not really, that's not really what the medieval people were exactly like. The Victorians had a vision or a fantasy of medieval life that is sort of its own thing. It's not Victorian, it's not medieval, it's Victorian medievalism. And I think a lot of, especially I'm very interested also in like when Victorian kind of aesthetics pop up online, all of these cottagecore accounts, dark academia accounts, things like that. There's so much interest in the Victorians. The Victorians are really kind of everywhere on those accounts. And it's like a version of the Victorians. And that's really fascinating to me. And I think I felt like, it's interesting after a while, if you're sort of you're studying the Victorians and you're sort of tracking which aspects of Victorian culture get picked up in our popular culture the most, you start to see that there are certain things that get picked up over and over again, and then other things that are maybe left out of the conversation. And so a big one was to sort of go back to your first point. So often now, because as I talk about in the book, I think we're living in a time of really, ambivalence or anxiety around our relationship with technology. Technology has evolved so quickly. And there are so many, I'm not saying anything that hasn't been said a million times before, but so many amazing things we can do with technology and so many horrible things that we can do with technology. And it's, I think it's fair to say like a point of kind of extreme cultural anxiety, and people have a lot of feelings about that. And so a lot of times when I see people talking about the Victorians, there's this sense of, as you were saying, kind of going back to an earlier time and like pull out your quill pen and your paper and put away your laptop and, just forget about
light
digital
a candle,
everything.
No
exactly.
electricity.
Candelabra. turn off the fluorescent lights. And that's sort of, it's very interesting to me because one of the things I was noticing when I went back through the Victorian Spiritualist periodicals was like, they were some of the first people to adopt new technology. Like cameras become available, not available in the way we think of them, but like photography begins to exist. And immediately they're like, can we photograph spirits? They're trying to use like phonographs and, anytime something becomes available, they're like, how do we use this for spiritualism? So they, in a lot of ways, had like the opposite impulse with their spiritualism. Like they were really interested in what you might almost call like the uncanny nature of technology. Like how can you sort of use technology, for all kinds of communication? And you definitely see echoes of that in sort of modern paranormal communities. Like if you watch paranormal TV shows, you definitely see there's more of an embrace of technology. I think it's more maybe in sort of witchcraft circles, cottagecore circles online, that there's more of this sense that like Victorian equals, rejection of technology. But that was something that was really fascinating to me. And I liked being able to sort of pick up with that thread kind of throughout the book in different chapters.
Yeah. And I also think it's probably, and this might not necessarily be true, but it seems to me that when we think of Victorian and all the fascinating things that we are obsessed with from that time period, we're really looking at fairly wealthy families and styles of living. Am I right? Like it's probably unfair. We're not really looking a lot at the lower class people in Victorian times. I don't know.
I think, yes, I think that's definitely very true. I think there's I would say middle class, sometimes middle class and up. And a lot of times it is upper class. And it's always funny for me because I'm a Victorianist who actually has like very little interest in the personal life of Queen Victoria. Yeah. Like I am not a scholar of Queen Victoria at all. Nothing against her, but like I'm very focused. I work a lot on crime as well. And so crime, a lot of times I'm sort of looking at the street life of London, essentially, which I find really fascinating. But that's another side that, like when people start talking about the Victorians and how kind of prim and proper they are, and there's this kind of like, well, that's complicated. And also you're thinking of very specific social circles.
Yeah.
So definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So something else that really jumped out at me was also in chapter 1, you included some text that was published by a prominent spiritualist named W.T. Stead, who did a lot of automatic writing. And this was communication that Stead said was from his spirit guide, Julia. And I found this text to be so fascinating because it's such a great response and could apply to people who have the same concerns about spirit communication today. I hear it a lot in this podcast. I hear it a lot from people who are upset with their families, criticizing them for being interested in the paranormal or mediumship, or you're dabbling into all these dangers. But yeah, this text, talks about the dangers of spiritualism. And I'm putting dangers in quotes kind of, and, why people should be concerned or why people shouldn't be concerned about reaching out to the dead. And so I wondered do you want to read this passage for us?
Sure.
It is awesome. I want to use it every time somebody is creeping all up on my Facebook telling me to be worried about what I do. I want to put this passage in there.
Absolutely. So it's the 2 paragraphs on 21, right?
Yes.
And let's see, this was, I forget which year, but it would have been the mid 1890s. Stead is sort of quoting, he had this spirit guide he was in contact with who he called Julia. That was his name when he did automatic writing. He believed that it was coming from a spirit guide named Julia. And so he, in one of his automatic writing sessions, produced these 2 paragraphs that I quote. So, quote, "The devil and his angels are no mere metaphysical abstractions. There are evil ones, false ones, frivolous ones on this side." And so this is Julia speaking. So it's supposed to be she's speaking on the other side, "as there are on yours. But the whole question is one of balance. And what I want to ask is this. Do you or anyone else in this world ever cut off your communications with your children when they have gone into the larger life of a city? Because they may bring you into the vortex of a city's temptations and the risk of evil and danger. You laugh at the suggestion. Why not laugh equally when those whom you love have passed on, not to New York or Chicago or London, but into the presence of God? I do not ask that you should open a door into your souls through which all who feel disposed on this side should enter in to possess it. You can, if you like, either on this side or on that, enter into companionship with the good or the bad. And I dare say that it is as true on this side as on that. There is a possibility of making acquaintances who may be difficult to shake off. But so it is in London. You did not shrink from coming up to London from the country, because in London there are many thousands of thieves, drunkards, swindlers, and men of evil and vicious life.
I love it. Like on Reddit and somebody's criticizing you, bam, Victorian statement. On Instagram, somebody's, bam. I love it. I'm gonna use it.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this quote. It's also, it's funny because it feels in many ways like it could have been written now. And then it's also so Victorian because there's all of this talk about like the Victorians had a lot of anxiety about the city and the evils of the city. And so she's talking all about the evils of the city. And it's so amazing. It's like timeless, but also so Victorian. So I love it.
It also reminds me of when I was in my first year of undergrad. This would have been 1997. And I didn't have an email address before then. And, I got my school email address.
Yeah.
And I thought I was so big and bad and cool. And I was excited and I was telling my mom about it. And she was like, oh, you be careful. I've heard so many don't you use that email address. Oh, I don't know why that makes me think of that, but dangers can be anywhere.
Yeah. No, well, and it's funny because deviating a bit from spiritualism, but there's so much, the period that I work on, mid-19th century, it was also sort of the rise of personal advertisements in newspapers. Like people started advertising for like matrimonial ads for the first time.
Oh, wow.
And I read some of the like anxieties people had then. It reminds me so much of like the Craigslist personal ad panic. Do you remember some of that where it was like, they're just meeting strangers off Craigslist. Like they don't know who they're meeting. And it was like, there's the exact same debate in like the 1860s when people start advertising for spouses. It's like respectable bachelor looking for wife. And everyone's like, you can't do that. You're going to meet someone crazy in the newspaper. So we're just living in the long 19th century.
Yeah. And it's funny because, I met my husband on Match.com and you'd look back now and you're like, oh my God, that was shady. How you met a couple of people online,
Yeah.
Match.com was a fairly new thing when you look back now and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe how trustworthy people were.
Yeah.
Or trusting, I guess. So, you mentioned, I don't remember if we were recording or not, but you mentioned a Llewellyn presentation that you did, and I watched it, and it was very good. And you talked a lot about psychometry.
Yes.
And, there are many spirit communication techniques or practices that were very popular in the Victorian era. And you say that the Victorians inherited most of them. It's not actually, original to them. But you did talk about psychometry. I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about that for us.
Absolutely. So psychometry, I have a feeling the audience will be familiar with it, but it's the idea, just in case not all of them are, it's the idea that the history of objects or all of the experiences that happen sort of around an object will sort of be energetically imprinted on the object. So if you've ever seen any kind of paranormal show or drama, it happens. The most recent Conjuring movie had a psychometry like scene in it. Frequently you see it in sort of crime dramas. Someone picks up something like a murder weapon, something from a murder scene, and they sort of see a vision of the crime. They see a vision of the murder. And I didn't really know actually until fairly at some point, I think when I was researching the book, what the term for that was. I'd seen it all over the place, but I didn't know what the term for it was. And the term is psychometry. I think the 2 points that I found really interesting about psychometry, and they both sort of relate to how psychometry is different from a lot of the other popular practices around that time. The first is that, as you say, psychometry, unlike astrology, which is incredibly old, palmistry, really old. What are some of the others? I mean,
scrying,
cartomancy, crystal gazing, cartomancy. I mean, these are old practices. So the Victorians obviously put their spin on these practices. You know, the spiritualist did slightly different things with them. The theosophist did slightly different things with them. But ultimately, these were sort of hand-me-downs that had been passed down to them. Psychometry, and I'm not saying that no one in history had ever had a vision from touching an object. You know, the idea that you can have a vision from touching an object is not necessarily what they invented, but the term and the practice of really kind of trying to deliberately trigger that, that was something that really came about in the mid-19th century. And the term was actually coined by an American doctor named Joseph Rhodes Buchanan. So he introduced it in the late 1840s. He actually wrote his first set of articles kind of introducing his theory of psychometry to the public right after the Fox sisters first sort of had the first big seances in Hydesville, New York. So it really came upon the scene right as spiritualism was just barely kicking off. So that, of course, is fascinating to me because it sort of suggests to me that there was sort of a need, an urge, something that the Victorians wanted to do, that these spiritualist practitioners wanted to do that was not fulfilled by any of the practices that they had inherited. You know, it was something that they couldn't do with astrology, that they couldn't do with anything else. They sort of needed kind of a new practice. So that's always interesting to me. And then the second one, and I think this sort of explains part of what they were looking for, is that most of the other practices, the way that the Victorians practiced them, they were really about looking into the future. So when they read cards, which usually they would have read playing cards rather than tarot cards, but when they read the cards, it was very much about strict prediction. When they were interested in astrology, their astrology was very rigidly predictive. We a lot of times are looking at things like personalities, but their astrology was often very rigidly predictive astrology. So a lot of these other practices were very, very predictive. Psychometry is all about the past. It's all about looking backwards. And especially the way that they practiced it, sometimes they were really interested in the idea of picking up not just a weapon from a murder from last week, but actually picking up an archaeological artifact that was 700 years old and trying to get a glimpse of the past from that. So they were very interested in the past and really the deep past. And that's really fascinating to me about psychometry, the fact that they felt the need to invent it and the fact that it seems that they wanted to develop that practice because they were so fascinated by, you know, what they could discover about the recent past and really the deep past. And then in the rest of the chapter, I talk a bit more about Victorians who became interested in the idea of using psychometry as an aid to criminal investigation, essentially, which is part of what my presentation was about. And I also talk about the fact, which I can talk about more if it's interesting, but the idea that detection and detective fiction was really also something that was kind of born of the 19th century. So detective fiction, as we currently understand it, did not really exist in the 18th century. There were precursors to it, but it was not an 18th century thing. It was a 19th century thing. So that was that chapter.
That was actually my next question. You know, the things we depend on today and things we'd consider to be pretty modern, you say the criminal investigation, but ballistics and fingerprint analysis and also criminal psychology and profiling, you know, and then along came paranormal investigation and the detective fiction that you're very passionate about. There's a nerdy question that popped in my mind that I don't know that I've ever thought about. And I wondered if you might not know because it's kind of dorky, but do you know if the Victorians had antique shops? You know, if they had an antique shop, what would be in an antique shop for Victorians? I was thinking about, you know, a lot of times when people practice psychometry, they'll get something that's old from an antique shop. And I'm like, what would they have grabbed to do that?
So I definitely know there's a few things that I know. I haven't looked explicitly at the term antique shop. I know that they were very interested in the idea of curiosities, curiosity cabinets, curio cabinets, and I think also curiosity shops. I'm not sure when antique shops began to be called antique shops. That's a really interesting question. Actually, I would like to know now. I know in the 18th century, the idea of the curio cabinet, curiosity cabinet, which was part of this kind of flowering of, which sort of started in the 18th century and really went into full swing in the 19th century, but sort of the flowering of theologies, archaeology, paleontology, geology, which was also in part, unfortunately, connected to, some British Victorians kind of traveling about, taking things from places that arguably they shouldn't have. But there was this real fascination in kind of stockpiling geological artifacts, fossils, archaeological artifacts, and even natural history oddities in a way, like if you found a two-headed bird or a two-headed goat or like odd specimens. So they became really fascinated. It's part of, I think, also the scientific revolution, this real fascination in specimens and having like a specimen cabinet. So that was definitely something that was big in the 18th century and sort of continued in a different form into the 19th century. And then I also know it's a little later then, but then the World's Fairs started and the grand, what are they? I can't think of the exact name, but the big World's Fairs, World Expositions. And those were a little bit different. They were a little more geared towards kind of displays of a lot of times what they saw as scientific advancements. But throughout the 19th century, there was definitely this kind of part of their understanding of science was sort of having a collection and having an exhibit.
The World's Fair stuff kind of collides into my obsession with, Victorians and spiritualism, because the 1904 World's Fair was here in St. Louis.
Yeah.
And then I start thinking about, Meet Me in St. Louis. And that's when I start watching that movie again and just thinking about all those homes that mostly are not there anymore. And what's so interesting is that all the exhibits are gone. There's two buildings that are still there that we use. We have a museum and I think there are a couple of other structures, but all these huge, massive Roman-like looking structures were all made to be temporary. And they ditched them and knocked them down. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what are you high? Don't you understand that we're going to be fascinated with you in the future? So we're in the solstice now, and we're coming out of Christmas, and this is actually the first interview I'm doing in the new year of 2024. But you do have in chapter 12, you reveal this haunted Christmas lore that is very haunting to me when I read it, and it involves bells underground and underwater in England. And I'll just go ahead and read it. It's actually from something else, right? It's from the Norfolk Garland by John Glyde. And it says, many legends of bells underground and underwater are known in various parts of England, where the churches are said to have been swallowed up either by earthquake or the ravages of the sea. The old church bells are said to ring deep, deep in the earth every Christmas morning, and people go forth and put their ears to the ground, hoping to catch the music of the mysterious chimes in the subterranean temple. I mean, creepy, but I mean, anything else about where that came from? Because that is so, I guess it kind of goes into Christmas wasn't always cheery and jolly and bright and starry. Sometimes they were into their haunted stories and their ghost stories and the darker parts of Christmas. But I'm like, okay, kids, let's go out and listen to the ghost bells. Put your ear to the ground.
Honestly, I don't know. I've meant to look up more about that particular legend. I picked it specifically. I was going through old books of folklore for the folklore chapter and for the Christmas chapter. And it was a very interesting experience going through these kind of mid-19th century or late 19th century, or in some cases, early 19th century books of folklore, because there would be figures and myths that were sort of very familiar to us now. The boggart, or these sort of, as soon as they say oh, a brownie, oh, a boggart, you're kind of like, oh yeah, we know those are familiar. A kelpie, and they would be right next to things that sometimes I had just never heard of before, didn't appear to pop up in literature afterwards. You can't really find much from Googling it. I think you would really need to go probably pretty deep into some archives that you just can't hit with Google or Google Scholar or kind of your typical search engines, which I do want to do with that myth. I also think some of these folklorists, they did just I think, record like legends, local legends that maybe they may appear only once in that book. Like they may not have been written down anywhere else. One of the things I talk about in the book that sort of, it's fascinating, but it's also like a little heartbreaking about studying folklore is that it can be so local. Like it can be so, you know, there are certain legends that maybe all of Britain might have had familiarity with. But then if you start going in, you go to a specific county, you go to a specific town, there's a specific hamlet, you know, every neighborhood might have had its own kind of legend about like one haunted tree or one place where something weird happened. You can just sort of keep going in and it will become more and more and more local. And that's in the folklore chapter, sort of what I talk about when I talk about channeling your inner folklorist is like, it doesn't need to be like the cryptid that your state is famous for or something. It could literally be if on your block, there's like, you know, the local 15-year-olds have like a story they tell about like a hollow tree or something. It could literally be that because a lot of folklore is deeply like regional. So with some of these, I don't know that they were recorded anywhere else. They might have really been limited to one area and one folklorist was fortunate enough to write it down and it didn't pop up again. But I don't know if that's the case with this.
It just came to me that, like, is it Lake Rainier that has, is said to have a cemetery that is under water? And even like, I know in the Lake of the Ozarks, you know, here in Missouri, Arkansas, I do think that, you know, there's always lore about, because it's a man-made lake and they've created it. And it's like, there was a small town under there. And things like that, I guess it's not so different from maybe some of the lore that we have now.
Yeah.
I guess last big question before I let you give us any final thoughts and where we can find you and bug you and all of those things. But I want to know, what are some of your favorite Victorian, rituals or activities that you incorporate into your life now?
Oh, that's a tough one. Let me think about that.
Whether it's accidental or, on purpose.
Victorian rituals I incorporate into my life.
Or activities or just...
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very avid, this came up in the bio, I'm a very avid journaler, but I'm not sure if I can, I think that's sort of a trans-historical thing. I definitely journal with pen and paper. Let's see. I read Victorian newspapers almost every day, so I think that's for my research.
Bingo, I think that counts.
I know. Other than that, I don't know if I think in many respects, I lead a very modern life, apart from reading all of the Victorian literature. Yeah, I read Victorian literature all the time, read Victorian newspapers all the time. This is a bit of a tangent, but one of the things I like about, the Victorians, I think maybe I talk about this in a chapter, I might have actually cut it, but I talk a little bit about the fact that they were, and this definitely goes back to sort of a little bit of a question of class, because obviously the Victorians who were working in factories all day didn't have the luxury of like a well-rounded education. So this is definitely kind of a class inflected issue. But for a lot of the Victorians I study who did have sort of the massive privilege of an education, they were much less chained to the idea of being hyper specialist than we are, like hyper specialized, like pick one thing and get really good at it. They had a lot more of this sort of like jack of all trades, like learn some music, learn some sketchbooking, write, study this language, study that language. Like they had a lot more freedom, again, the ones who had the privilege of that kind of education, to really kind of explore and try things. I feel like we're much more focused on kind of specializing, niching down. So I think just generally I try to sometimes, when I have the luxury, which I don't always, to try to bring that attitude sometimes to when I'm learning and reading and studying, and just like try a sketchbook, try a scrapbook, go out and be a naturalist for a day.
So, you're not walking around during the day holding a candelabra.
I will say I am definitely not. I have massive admiration for everyone who is a Victorian like reenactor on social media and who lived like have those amazing Victorian aesthetic accounts where it's like, here's their Victorian bedroom. I do not have that at all. I don't have the patience for that. I love to look at it, but I definitely do not have that kind of setup in my life. No.
I know I've told this story before, so my listeners have heard it and they curse me because I, in this podcast, have always prided myself that we try to create the illusion that we are listening in a Victorian parlor and, we light the candles before the episode starts and we blow them out. And sometimes I'll have a candelabra next to me and, sometimes I'll have them on or whatever. And there was one day that I was cleaning my parlor / spare bedroom and here in the studio, and I was sitting in a chair on the other side of this computer, and I just decided, I'm going to give my listeners a little sneak peek. And so I took a picture from the other side, which the messy side, because I was cleaning it all up, and I posted it in my group for listeners on Facebook, and it destroyed them. They were like, what? All these years I imagined, when I listened that we're sitting here in the parlor and you just ruined it for me. I'm like, man, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
It's reality. But I do try. I mean, I would love, I almost put my husband to putting some crazy old, crown molding and like what do they call in the center where the chandelier would have hung
like a medallion.
Medallion. Yeah. Get a big medallion and add some big funky drapes and just pretend because I do not live in a Victorian home, but and then my husband's always like, but resale value? Who's going to buy this modern house with this funky parlor in a spare bedroom?
Yeah. Well, and the Victorian aesthetic is beautiful, but it is so high maintenance. It is like
every style in the world smashed in together.
Dusting alone will keep you busy all day.
Oh my gosh. Well, you are fabulous. I want to give you the opportunity to give any final thoughts you have and maybe things that are coming up, any more projects, and where we can find you.
Let's see. I might be at Austin Witch Fest in April. I have not confirmed that yet. There are a couple of things I have to check on. So I might be at Austin Witch Fest. Other than that, I think I'm fairly low profile the next month or so as I wrap up some other writing. Upcoming projects. Let's see. Nothing coming out immediately. Hopefully some fiction eventually. I want to write some Victorian historical fiction, so we'll see. But that's the next big writing project. Online, I usually go by @Steele Arcana, so SteeleArcana. So that's my handle anywhere that I have an account. I'm sort of consciously uncoupling from Twitter at the moment, so I'm not super active there.
Word.
But I do have a Facebook page, which I want to be more active on soon. And if I posted anything anywhere, it's usually on Instagram. So that's where I'm most active.
Well, do let us know about that fiction when you get to it, because that's going to be super juicy for us. We would love to hear about that. You totally rock. I enjoyed this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I love this podcast. Thank you very much.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com. And you can continue the discussion and hang out with a great community of paranerds by joining us in the Big Seance Parlor on Facebook. Want to hear your voice in a future episode? Go to bigseance.com/feedback to learn how. Thank you so much for listening. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time. Thank you to the following super paranerds who support the show at patreon.com/Big Seance. Jen, Michael Henson, Daryl, Anne-Marie Sullivan, Natalie N., Kim Robb, Josie L. Lorenzo, and Susan Davey. My supporters at the Parlor Guest level, who can be found at bigseance.com/parlorguests, are Anne Rekovich from ozparatech.com, Dina DeCastro of Dina DeCastro Astrology, Janae Michaels from Grey House Tarot and Farm Artifacts, Amy Park Gedicke of amyparkg.com, Lonnie Scott from weirdwebradio.com, Lana and John of Carbon Lilies, Midge Munster from midgemunster.com, Heather N. of dancingbeealchemy.com, Diane Razmataz, Sue, Tracy, Andrew Watson, Amy Taylor, Danielle Hemberry, Christine Rathselhe, Mindy Kintop, Hope Battaglia, Cass and Bailey, Melissa Armour, Janet Shaw Binns, Bruce Williams, and Christopher Kohler. And I currently have 4 fabulous listeners who support the show at the $10 level, which isn't even a thing. These paranerds are Glenna Becker, Peggy Hagan, and Steve, and the lovely Judy Skinner. Also, I have 3 wonderful listeners who support the show at the completely made up $20 level. And those peeps are Norman and Linda Keller and Kevin Gilbert. Thank you, paranerds.